Hey friend, welcome to Authentic Performance, the podcast. My name is Nat and I'm your host. At Authentic Performance, our mission is to provide education and advocacy for all athletes, developing awareness surrounding identity, purpose, and health, so athletes can live well beyond their sport. This week, our guest is Christine Yu. Christine is an award-winning journalist whose work focuses on the intersection of sports science and women athletes. Her writing has appeared in Outside, The Washington Post, Time, Runner's World, and other publications. She's a lifelong athlete and yoga teacher who loves running, surfing, and skiing. She also lives in Brooklyn, New York. Most recently, Christine published a book called Up to Speed, which talks about many barriers female athletes face and common myths about a woman's body. You'll get to hear about some of these topics today, but I highly recommend checking out Up to Speed on your own and learning how you can better support the female athletes in your life. Now let's hear from Christine. Okay, welcome Christine. Thank you so much for being here. It's so nice to get to sit down and have a conversation. I've been looking forward to this for weeks. So to start things off, I'm going to give you a chance to tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be here and for this conversation. So I'm Christine Yu. I'm a journalist and I cover mostly sports and science and health. And kind of within that, I particularly like to cover stories about women, so women's sports, women's performance, all that fun stuff. I recently wrote a book called Up to Speed: The Groundbreaking Science of Women Athletes that looks at the underrepresentation of women in sports science research, and that came out in May 2023, so just a couple months ago.
Yeah, very cool. I actually have it sitting right here. I love it. Number one, I think for me as a female, I was an athlete. Now I'm still active, but no longer competing. But it just feels so good to be validated in a lot of things that maybe weren't before. Um, I'm curious, what does your job kind of look like as a sports and science journalist? What's a typical day? What are some of the things that you are kind of covering, I guess?
Yeah, I kind of laugh because I'm like, what is my typical day? It's like me like trying to motivate myself to sit in front of my computer and like write something, which, right, I feel like that's what we all try to do. Um, but it really depends. So I'm a freelance journalist, so meaning that, I'm not on staff at any one publication. So I am often working on different assignments for a variety of different publications. So that can be kind of newspapers, digital magazines, publications, university, like alumni publications, as well as like kind of more business to business or like association magazines and the like. So a lot of my day is tracking down people. It's like tracking down people to interview and sources. A lot of following up on those email requests, trying to just get people in line, and doing research, right? Like kind of reading up on different things, and just then obviously taking all that information and trying to just make it into a coherent story. And that's, I think, what I love best about my job is because I get to write about a lot of different things, and a lot of different topics. So I'm constantly learning and I get to talk to like the best people in the field who are doing this work, which I think is my favorite part, is interviewing folks. And yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's like, for me, it feels a lot like putting together a puzzle. I'm often like sitting in front of my computer being like, oh my God, I can't write. Like, how do I write? Like, I've forgotten how to write. I don't know how to do this anymore. But it's almost like, I don't know, it's like this weird thing that happens at some point and like it magically comes together. I'm kind of terrified of the day that it doesn't come together, right? But yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell what I do.
Very cool. And so in your book, you talk a little bit about being an athlete. So where did your passion for sports come from? What did your athletic journey look like?
Yeah, I grew up swimming and skiing, with my family. Didn't really, I started playing like organized sports in fourth grade, I had switched schools and started at a private school. And, the school, I mean, you had to play sports, like it was a requirement. And in a way, I feel like that was a really fortuitous thing because, my parents were born in China, grew up in Hong Kong, moved here, kind of the typical immigrant story, right? Like they cared mostly about our grades and that we did well in school. They weren't particularly sporty or athletic. Um, and so that wasn't the priority. And so I wonder if I wasn't forced to play sports or required to play sports, if I would have had that opportunity, right? But because I had that opportunity at like a young age, and it was kind of positioned in a way, it's like, well, everyone does it, right? Like it wasn't anything particularly special in a way, even though there were some of my classmates who were like phenomenal athletes and playing on like travel teams and stuff like that. But because it was just like, this is just the thing that you do, it kind of just became like the thing that I did and like was part of my life. And so I always kind of played sports. But yeah, I feel like I've played everything, a little bit of everything under the sun, for good or for bad, right? But it's always been a big part of my life. And then just as a family, we always watch sports too on TV, or we'd go to Yankees games or Mets games and, we'd watch football. I mean, obviously it was a lot of men's sports at the time when I was growing up, but
Very cool. Yeah, I went to a very small school. It was a public high school, but in a really really tiny town, and so we had a similar thing. It wasn't technically required, but if I didn't play and my other classmates didn't play, then we didn't have a team because we
yeah.
just barely had enough people. And so I ended up playing 3 sports all through high school just for that reason. Like I wonder sometimes if I would have played all of those 3 sports. My parents both played college sports and everything, but I don't know if I would have played more than one if I was
Yeah.
at a different school. So it's interesting how that kind of impacts our participation. I want to go into some of the things that you talk about in your book. For anyone listening, if you want to learn more about these things, you need to just read the book because it's so good. But I want to talk first about the history of female athletics. Can you give us just a little bit of a rundown of what it's looked like for females in sports?
It's been hard, right? Like, I think it's no surprise that sports has always been a male dominated domain, back all the way back to like ancient Greeks, ancient Rome. Um, it was that realm in which men could display their masculinity, right? Or test themselves. And those sports and those activities were all geared and designed around men and kind of male participation. Women were not allowed to come and participate or walk onto the athletic arena. They were discouraged from doing so because they thought that it was contrary to being like to their femininity, right? Or there was concerns about how it would affect women's reproductive system. And that's god god forbid, like it affects someone's reproductive system, because that was like women's primary role in society, right? So we had to protect that. And there, I mean, this isn't to say that there weren't women who participated in sports and and were doing some of this stuff, but it was very much like kind of on the fringes. And even in, I think, ancient Greece, right, they had they had the modern Olympics, or like Olympic type games, but then they had like these separate games for women where, like, the length of the races were shortened to accommodate women's, like, demeanor and like their feminine, again, their fragile bodies and all of this stuff. But it was seen as this thing that wasn't appropriate. And that kind of carries throughout history, that sports continued to be this realm for men, and it was never thought of as this place that was appropriate for women, again, for these reasons, where it was like it could harm your reproductive system, it was bad for you in some way. There were, when folks started to think about like what's exercise for women, what's exercise for men, they would say things like, women could essentially, it was like, take a walk after dinner and yell at their servants. That was enough exercise for them. Or talking, since women are so loquacious, right? So talkative. That was enough exercise for them. So just from the beginning, there were the system and the itself was just set up in a way to not accommodate women. And so there are these constant barriers in place. And throughout history, we see women like who want to participate in sports and who want to play, and they constantly have to come up against these barriers and either overcome them, right, or almost like shed parts of themselves as women on the sidelines before they could step onto the field, if that makes sense. And there are lots of examples in which women were actually really successful in sport, and as soon as they became successful, kind of the male led institutions around those sports would like clamp down on it. So like one example is, during, I think it was World War I, when all the men were off to war in England, like they used to have soccer teams associated with a lot of these companies and factories and stuff like that. And so when all the men were off at war, the women came and worked in the factories, right? And those women would also play soccer, and they became so popular. There were so many people that came out and watched these women play that it was like a thought to be a threat, right? So what's essentially the soccer association in England at the time essentially put a ban in place that prohibited women from playing professional soccer until 1971, I believe. So it basically prohibited them from like going onto the fields, from like referees, right? Officiating games, like all of these things that made it just really impossible for women to play sports.
Yeah, and it's so interesting because we see even now sometimes like there's the pushback, um, and so I thought it was so interesting. I read something the other day after the huge game with Nebraska, setting like this record for people attending female sports, and they were like, "We can do it. Like they've proven. Now just let them
Yeah.
do it because there has been such a long progression of slowly getting to do things. But even in reading your book, I was so surprised by some of the dates of like when these things have happened, how recent this is. I mean, there's still so much, so many ways that we can improve. um, how has the sex and gender bias been ingrained into our society even today, now that we're looking more closely at female sports?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it is shocking to me, like you said, how recent a lot of this stuff is. Like it's not that long ago. Title IX is 50 years old, basically, right? Like that's really not that long ago that we're starting to see these changes. But I think, to your point, what you're saying about like the Nebraska, right, volleyball match and like breaking these like attendance records and stuff, it constantly feels like we have to keep proving that women's sports is worth it, right? It's like we broke this attendance record, we broke this viewership record, we broke this revenue record, and then we do it again, right? The next year, the next season. And it for me, it makes me wonder. I'm like, well, at what point can we stop this, right? Like, why do we have to keep proving that there is a fan base, that people are interested? Um, and not, again, recognizing the fact that there are all of these factors and barriers in place that have made it so hard for women to play sports, that have made it so hard for women's sports to thrive. And yet we're breaking all of these records. We're showing so much interest in this, but they're still at that top level, at, those leaders of these federations and sports organizations and what have you, brands, whatever, um, are still so reluctant to see that, right? Or at least to accept it. And I think that I'm trying to think of a good example of this, but I mean, you could look at the um, like the Women's World Cup this summer, right? Again, like this tremendous success and interest in this tournament, right? And I think it's interesting to look at some of the media stories that came out, right? In particular with regard to like the United States, because the United States was overwhelmingly favored to win. And because we got knocked out so early, it's a failure, right? Like it's all these things that are wrong. But the fact of the matter is, if you actually kind of zoom out a little bit and look at the fact that like there are all these countries and teams that qualified for the tournament for the very first time. There are all these countries and teams that are leveling up because of what the US women's national team has done, because of the level of play that they are now demanding, not only set by example by the women's national team, but like across all of these professional leagues, you know, in Europe and in Australia and all of these places, right? So that's the really exciting piece, I think, right? It's not, there's this tendency to constantly look for the negative thing, the thing to knock down women's sports, rather than seeing like, oh my gosh, all of this progress is happening and it's really exciting, and like that deserves attention. And the fact that like, what was it? It was like youth soccer signups in Australia following the World Cup went up like 170%. Like that's the impact that we see from this. That's the like the power of women's sports, and the like you see how like powerful those stories and those athletes are. I don't know if I answered your question, but like
No,
for me,
that's
that's what
great.
like I think is really exciting.
Yeah, I mean, it is hard to watch female sports have to, like you said, prove these things because it's not a new thing that females are successful in sport. It's not a new thing that they're physically able to do incredible things. It's just a new thing that it's accepted sometimes. You know,
Sometimes.
there's still a lot of that negativity, I guess, of female sports, but um, I would like to talk a little bit about the lack of resources because I know even today there is I've noticed it even when I played college basketball for 1 year. The amount just little things, but the amount of gear that my team received in comparison to the male team at the same exact school. But one of the examples that you used was the NCAA tournament,
Mm-hmm.
and I remember watching that video that came out showing the difference between the women's equipment and the men's. So why is there still this lack of resources, and what does it look like to move forward so that there is equal opportunity for females, especially since we already have to go through so many barriers to get to the same position as male athletes?
Yeah, I mean, I remember seeing those videos too and just being like, this got to be a joke, right? Like, this is not real. And, you know, for folks who don't remember, there are these videos of the men's tournament, like the weight room, and it was like huge and beautiful and tricked out. And there was so much equipment, so many squat racks, so many, like everything you could think of that you would need for these like really elite athletes to train. And then there was like a picture of basically like a dumbbell tree, right? So it's like what, up to, I don't know, probably like 20 pounds or something, like these like rubber coated dumbbells, and then a bunch of yoga mats. And that's what the women had. And it honestly felt like a big joke. It's like how these athletes are like phenomenal, right? They're so talented. They are like demand or train so hard and demand so much of themselves to perform at this level in which they're performing, and yet this is what you give them. And so I think it's a really good example of how, again, this like sexism and bias is entrenched in the system, because, you know, obviously this led to a huge investigation and all of that, but the reason that like, part of the reason why this happened is that because it was just built into the system, the NCAA system, right? Because men's college basketball is such a big moneymaker. This March Madness tournament is a huge moneymaker. That is NCAA's priority, right? That's where they focus all their energy, you know, their priorities, like the resources, everything goes to that. But, and there's something about the way that, you know, different contracts are structured, whatnot, that kind of disadvantages the women's side, but it's built on this assumption that the women's tournament is not a moneymaker. There's no interest in it. People don't care. And so it's this like that age old thing of I feel like, you know, women have grown up with that you should just be happy to play. You should just be happy to have this opportunity, right? And it runs through even this top level of sport, that like you should just be happy that you have this tournament and you have these like yoga mats. Like it's better than nothing. But they didn't even think about that. And I just feel like that just epitomizes this, how these institutions prioritize men's versus women's sports, and and not even basing that on any sort of sense of reality or facts, right? It's based on assumptions, and assumptions that these male led organizations have as to what the value is of women's sports. And I think that that's a really big thing that's hard to unpack, but that we need to, right? That we need to start paying attention to this. Because there's, people often talk about the fact that like men's sports have had centuries to develop, centuries to build up or at least decades, right? Like to build up these fan bases, to build up these resources and this infrastructure to support it. And women's sports, like we talked about, really hasn't had that long, runway to develop. It's been a pretty short, steep pitch to get to where they are, and with no investment and no resources. And yet they're expected to perform at the same level that these men are, right? To draw on the same numbers and viewership and revenue and all of this stuff, when they haven't really even been given any of the resources to support them to do that.
Yeah, I would love to talk too about how like the research is impacted, because I know that's a big thing. Just the lack of um, resources that are pulled for that research specifically with female athletes. So what does that kind of look like right now? And what is the future for research in female athletics?
Yeah, so the vast majority of research, like sports science, exercise physiology research is based on men. And the statistics are that about a third of research participants are women, and only 6% of these studies focus specifically on women. So that's a pretty minuscule proportion. And this is looking at studies between 2014 and 2020. So again, not very long ago. When I first came across that statistic, I was expecting this to be like in the 90s, right? But like, oh no, this is like a couple of years ago. But what that means is that, I think as we've seen women's sports really accelerate, right? Both in terms of just the athleticism that these athletes demonstrate, the dynamism, the intensity of their games, and like the density of their games too, right? The amount of games that they're playing in any one season, like all of that has increased, and all of that has like kind of been pushed up and up and up as we expect more from these women athletes. But what hasn't kept pace is this research component of it. We haven't really studied, what it means to train, for female athletes and female bodies to train at this higher level of performance, what it means to help them adapt to that, what it means to help them, adapt and recover to like these more intense, more densely packed games and schedules, how that influences things like injury and recovery from injury and just long-term athletic development. We really haven't looked at any of these things. So we have this really shaky, like scaffolding, if you will, that's holding this up. And so we see it, or we continue to see it in things like, the number of ACL tears in female athletes. And that was a big story this summer with the World Cup, when you had, I think it was like over 20 players that had to sit out of this like career defining tournament because they had a traumatic knee injury. And it's like, no, it's not a small thing, right? Like it's a really long recovery period. But we've known that women tend to tear their ACL more than men since the late 80s, early 90s. And yet that prevalence rate hasn't changed in all of these years. We haven't really done anything to fix that or, amend that in any way. Whereas I think, in that same period of time, the number of ACL tears in men have actually gone down, which is interesting. But, but to the point being that like, we're not taking care of our athletes. And if we don't take care of our athletes, we can't have women's sports. You can't have sports without your athletes. And so I think that that's just, one example of the way that the lack of research is really doing a disservice, to women across the board. Because it's not just the professional folks, right? It's girls too who are suffering these tears, and that affects their athletic progression down the line in their careers, should they choose to, right, go to play collegiate sports or try to go pro.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. Like you talked about in your book about how females are just harder to study because there are so many other factors.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but unfortunately, you still have to get around those things, and I think it's because of a lot of those differences that we do need more research too. Like there's still a lot of things that we don't understand about females because it's not been researched and it is different than males. And like you talk about how there's the standard man is kind
Mm-hmm.
of, pushed, but then when we just assume that it's the same for females, that they're just a smaller man or whatever, the perspective is, then it can be really damaging for them since it is so different. Um, so I would love for you to tell us a little bit about the female athlete triad. That was something that really stuck out to me. What is it, and why is it so important to know about?
Yeah, so the female athlete triad is this kind of interconnect, like these three different conditions that are somewhat interconnected. So it's looking at energy availability in the bodies, right? So the amount of fuel and energy that your body has, obviously through nutrition, through eating, to be able to support activities of daily life, as well as exercise or training or anything like that. So it's looking at energy availability. Um, it's looking at bone health, and it's looking at menstrual cycle health. So, researchers first started noticing this back in, again, I want to say like the 80s and 90s, that sometimes these high performing athletes, like Olympians and whatnot, um, because they were training at such a high level, they would be experiencing this menstrual cycle dysfunction, right? They'd have absent cycles or irregular cycles. And what they noticed with that too is that that was often also related to having bone stress injuries or poor bone health. So, like early onset osteoporosis and all of these things. And so, when they looked at it deeper, they realized that a lot of it was connected to this idea of, like I said, energy availability, like the amount of energy that your body has to function. And so, what they found is that if your body doesn't have enough energy, like I like to think of it almost like a gas tank, right, for your car. If you don't have enough gas in your tank, or you're kind of running on fumes, right? Like the lights go off, and like you're like, oh crap, I need to get to a gas station right away, right? Because otherwise your car is going to stall out. You're going to like not be able to drive. And so there's something similar kind of happens in the body, right? In that when you don't have enough energy, the body starts to freak out and thinks that it's starving or going to be starving pretty soon. And so because of that, it starts to shut down like non-essential systems. And one of those first systems that it shuts down is the reproductive system. So that's why you see, irregularity with menstrual cycles, or why, menstrual cycles might stop. But the problem with that is that those hormones that are associated with the menstrual cycle aren't their job isn't just to regulate fertility, right? Which is what I think most of us have learned it to be. Those hormones have really important jobs related to bone health, related to muscle health, related to cardiovascular health, like pretty much every system in the body. And so when those hormones kind of go a little haywire, it affects all these other systems, and can be pretty detrimental. The reason that important is like female athlete triad, it can occur across the lifespan. But I think the most concerning period of time is really around adolescence, because that's the period of time in which your body is laying down bone. It's building what's going to be your adult bone mass. Again, something I never learned about when I was younger, right? But you need that monthly surge of estrogen from your menstrual cycle to support that bone growth and that bone health. When you don't have that, you are not you're not building healthy bone. And so again, that's what puts you at risk for bone stress injuries and stress fractures and early onset osteoporosis. And it's one of these things where you accumulate your adult bone mass, in adolescence, and roughly around like when you're 20, I think you lay down about 80% of your adult bone mass. But if you don't reach your full potential, if you don't do all of that, like, you can't go back and fix it, right? You have what you have. And so if you're not kind of reaching your full potential, you're working from a lower baseline than someone else. And so again, that puts you at risk for other bone stress injuries.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me. I mean, it makes sense, but I never even considered a lot of these things. I know it's so common for female athletes to not have a period for an extended period of time. And I thought it was so interesting that you said, like, that, and also like disordered eating and body image issues, they're just part of the athletic experience. Like for females, a lot of times that's how people see it, instead of seeing it as a real issue, that these things are so common, and that it's not something that should be happening, but unfortunately is happening a lot. So why are these altered or delayed menstrual cycles so common? What's kind of the cause of that for females, and what do we do to avoid that?
Yeah, it's really complicated, right? Like, and I think it's there are a lot of different intertwined factors. So, I mean, to your point about so many females not having a cycle, I mean, that's still such a prevalent myth. This idea that if you don't have a menstrual cycle, like, it's a good thing. It means that you're really fit, that you've been working really hard, and it's almost like this badge of honor, right? But really, like I said, the menstrual cycle is almost like a fifth vital sign. It's a sign that, like, your hormonal health is good, like your hormones are functioning well. So I think, like I said, there's a lot of different factors. I think that on one level, take a sport like running, right? Like, and you have um, girls who are prepubescent, kind of entering into puberty, running, and they're, and if they're good runners, right, like, they're performing really well. And then when you enter into puberty, what often happens, right, your body changes. You start to gain a little bit more fat, your body composition changes. Like, frankly, you're just adjusting to your own body, but your body feels less responsive. So it feels like your performance stagnates or your performance drops off. And so you have some of these young girls who see some of the older girls, like, stop performing well. So there's this idea that you want to stop or stall menstruation and puberty as like a good thing to kind of keep your performance up. So I feel like that, like, on the one hand, we have all of these myths and these misconceptions about what's going on, because there's, if you are really performance driven, there's this, I get it, right? Like, you want to keep performing well. Like, it's really enticing, and it's really, like, especially if it's part of your identity, like, that's a big piece of it. I think, kind of connected to that is the fact that we live in a culture and society that is, filled with these messages and ideas about what women should look like, what our bodies should look like, how small they should be. And then when you couple that with kind of athletes, and we look at Olympians and pro athletes, and we see they're like extremely lean and cut bodies, and like, so, they're so like muscular, and like all of these things, like, we start to get in our head this idea of what what I should look like, right? Like, what this like an ideal athlete bodies look like, and somehow if I look like that, I'll perform like that. And so that can again lead to some of these disordered eating behaviors, right? You're starting to restrict your eating so that you can lose weight, so that you can kind of tinker with body composition. And again, if you're in a sport like running or cycling or other like endurance-based sports where, like, yeah, sure, body composition matters, but I feel like, again, we almost put too much emphasis on it and think that it's the only thing that matters, that it's the thing that's going to lead to athletic performance and success, right? So I think, like, those are a lot of, some of the complicating issues with that. And then just the fact that, like, we don't talk about nutrition really well, and we don't teach kids about it really well. I know it's somewhat changing a little bit, but like for me growing up, like I never really learned about nutrition in that way or really thought about what it meant to nourish my body, especially if I was playing sports. It was all the messages that I got was, dieting and losing weight and don't eat carbs and like all of these other things, that it's really hard to kind of cut through all of that noise. So I think like that's another piece of it. It's like we think that food and nutrition, sure, is important in a certain way, but I don't think we appreciate really how important it is to make sure that we are eating sufficiently every day across the day, the entire span of the day. And that means more than just like, I don't know, doing some funky diet or something.
Yeah, and it's so interesting. I think there's a lot of social factors even for the nutrition and eating with females specifically. I was just talking with one of my roommates and she said, "Well, I've been asked before like are you really going to eat all of that or is that really,
Mm-hmm.
uh, do you need all of that food right now?" And I think it's so interesting because especially for female athletes like you really do need to be nourishing your body and eating that food, and it's because of this like understanding that females should just eat less and be smaller that sometimes I think that disordered eating can come into play, or even just under fueling in a lot of different
Yeah.
situations just because of that social perception of like, oh, maybe I'm not supposed to be eating as much as males even when I'm pushing my
Yeah.
body to new limitations and doing all this exercise. It's like, no, we do need to really value nutrition, not just because of performance, but also just for like health in general. um
Yeah.
I'm interested in knowing, um obviously there's a lack of research for female athletes in a lot of areas, but specifically on how menstruation affects performance. So, would you recommend this new kind of fad of cycle syncing nutrition or fitness? Why or why not?
Yeah. I have a lot I have a lot of thoughts about cycle syncing. Um, so cycle syncing, this idea that because our hormones fluctuate through these different phases of the menstrual cycle, and those hormones have different roles or can have different effects on the body. Is there a way to almost like take advantage of these hormonal peaks and valleys, to, yeah, help us get fit or perform better, right? Or feel better. And so I think on the one hand, I think tracking your cycle is really helpful. I think that it's, again, one of these things because we haven't been taught about our cycles and our bodies very much growing up, and as frankly as older women too. I think it's really powerful exercise to do, to really just take some time to kind of tune into like what is going on with my body, right? Like, do and there may or may not even be these cycle related symptoms, but like you won't know until you actually start to pay attention, right? And I think, at least for me, when I started doing it, it helped me realize that some of these things weren't my fault. So like would consistently feel flat like the third week of my cycle. But like I would always like beat myself up and be like, oh, I'm just not working hard enough. I'm not, I'm just lazy or whatever it is. But then when I've tracked it and realized like, oh wait, this happens like every month. Maybe it's not my effort level, but maybe it is like hormonal related. So in that sense, like it's just helpful knowledge to have about your own body and your own experience. And because that experience also changes potentially month to month, but also over the course of the lifespan, then you can get a sense of like what's normal for you and notice when something is abnormal, right? Or is off or different. So I think that's a really great thing to do. Where I think we kind of get into some of the like muddier waters is when we start to do something like more of like a like cycle syncing plan, right? Like here's my 28-day plan for you. And it's like day one, you did this, or like, day 1 through 7, you do this type of exercise or eat this type of food. Day 7 through or 8 through 15, you do this. And it's just like this generalized plan about like what women should do. And the problem with that is a couple. One is that like not everyone's cycle is 28 days. Like cycles can range from like 21 days to 30 days. And again, that can differ throughout the month. Not everyone's going to have like ovulation, flat in the middle. So it's you can't easily just separate like your follicular phase from your luteal phase and all of that. But but I get it. I understand why these things are really attractive because again, like we realize we don't have this information and we want information. We want to know how to feel better. So I am kind of, cautious about those types of plans that are like, here's 28 days. Here's what you do day one, very more prescriptive in that way. What I do think is helpful is again, like tracking your own cycle and understanding what symptoms may be hormonally related, because again, some of them might not be. They might just be kind of one off things or things that just happen randomly that have nothing to do with your cycle. But when you can start to pinpoint some symptoms that look like they might be hormonally related, you can then not only just anticipate that, but then start to be proactive in how you adjust your own training and nutrition to that, right? So it's not saying like, here's one size fits all plan, but here's me paying attention to what's going on with my cycle and my body. And okay, given that information, now I can maybe tailor some things to my cycle. Maybe now, like if it is the third week of my cycle that I'm always flat, maybe it's like, maybe I should be hydrating better. Maybe I should actually be trying to sleep more instead of like futzing around at night, and like those types of things that you can start to do. Or maybe, that means front loading or shifting some of my workouts. So like those higher intensity, like more quality workouts that I need, I shift it to a different part of the week so that I can make sure that I can do them well versus like kind of half-assing my way through it. And then like I shift kind of lower intensity stuff to like the part where I'm feeling flat. So that's where I think it is powerful to pay attention to your cycle and to like, quote unquote sync with your cycle. But it's not these like, plans that kind of people are showing.
Yeah, and it's so hard with any kind of generalized fitness or nutrition program because people in general are so different. But I do think I love that you talked about like understanding more about yourself. I don't think it's ever going to be a bad thing to just understand your body a little bit better. I think it could help your relationship with your body, and then also just understanding what kind of workouts are valuable for you and what you can do in a healthy setting as well. Not just, I mean, and I know it's hard, especially for athletes, like if you're training with a team, you don't always have the liberty to say like, yeah, this week I'm just gonna take it completely easy. I typically am not as strong in this week, but I also think it's valuable for coaches and trainers and everything to be in conversation with athletes too about like how can we support you during this time and what's going to work best, especially because like we talk about the injuries, like that's a big thing for females, and if you're not getting what you need and not understanding what your body needs at different times, that could be a really big problem. So I think that's such a valuable thing to just understand a little bit better. And I mean, I'm definitely not an expert at any of this stuff, but I do think just the awareness piece is huge. So I think that's an important thing for everyone to just kind of be aware of.
Yeah. And I think like to your point too about, coaches, it's not to say like I know, still a lot of coaches are men and it's like it's not like you have to talk to every one of your female athletes and be like, tell me about your menstrual cycle. It's not even that. It's just being aware of it yourself as a factor, because the menstrual cycle is just part of a female body's physiology and something that needs to be accounted for. But also just, I think it's the awareness of not making your athletes feel badly, right? Or feel like it's their fault or, something like that. But just, again, it's like you said, it's not that you can make accommodations for every single person, but it brings another level of context and information that can be helpful to your coach or trainers or whoever else you're working with.
Yeah, and just as female athletes, you then feel more validated and supported in your health journey if you just feel like someone cares about how you're,
Yeah.
feeling just a little bit. Again, like not changing the entire plan to, around you, because if you've got a team, I
Yeah.
think of even just like a basketball team of like 12 girls, like obviously you can't fit every single person's needs, but just being aware of it, like checking in, like, how are you doing today? Like, how do you feel? Those kind of things can be really valuable just for a more cohesive team if every single individual is feeling more supported.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
I want to talk a little bit about gear for females because this is such an interesting topic and honestly one that I had not even thought about before reading your book. So, can you explain the meaning of the phrase shrink it and pink it when talking about female athletic gear?
So when unsurprisingly, right, the vast majority of gear had first developed for men because those were the people that were playing sports or doing these like outdoor adventures and stuff like that. That was the market. And so when these brands and manufacturers and sporting good companies, finally realized, they're like, huh, like women actually want some of this stuff too, and women want to, go out and play sports and do stuff and not have to just wear like hand-me-downs or like these ill-fitting, pieces of clothing. They, in order to make like the women's gear, for the most part, what they would do is that, they would take the men's gear, kind of size it down, to make it a little smaller, maybe like nip in the waist a little bit so it wasn't such a boxy cut, or like add a cap sleeve. It's like they would make these adjustments to make it look more feminine. And they would pink it, right? They would make it pink or purple or some floral pattern or paisley or, something like that. Would always drive me crazy. I'm like, why is paisley like a girl's pattern? Like, I hate it. But they would do this and then they would market it to women. And at that point, you know, this is largely like probably like late 70s, 80s, early 90s. That's what you had. Those were your options. You like there was no other real options out there. Um, but in doing that, yes, they were getting gear out to these women, but oftentimes um, it wouldn't necessarily take into account women's needs, what women actually wanted and expected from their gear. And a lot of the gear tended to be almost like entry level stuff, right? So, you know, stuff that wouldn't necessarily hold up if you're trying to do more advanced levels of your sport or anything like that, right? Or trying to progress in your sport, like whether it's skiing or cycling or anything like that. You kind of just have this beginner entry level stuff. So yeah, there's been a big kind of thankfully, I guess, like backlash against that, in that, we're starting to see a lot more women specific gear, brands and companies that are founded by women, who have women led design teams, who are creating really good quality products that do meet the needs of women. Because part of the problem is that, aside from just like, you know, shape and design and how it fits on a woman's body, there's certain like physiological and anatomical things that make a difference. So, women regulate temperature differently from men. So that might impact things like sleeping bags, right? Or like jackets and vents and, how that works. Or if you think about even something as simple as like hydration vests or backpacks. If you take the men's model and kind of size it down, sometimes you would have straps and clips and all these things in really like not great spots, right? Across your boobs or, everything, or they would still be like really long, but just like hit real funny. Other times, in terms of like scaling down garments, they would get rid of features like pockets, right? Like the men's version would have all these great useful pockets and the women's one would have these fake pockets. Those types of things that really kind of undermine women and our ability to not only just be comfortable but to perform, because that's what you need. You want to be just comfortable. You don't want to think about your clothing, right? And constantly like futzing with it and shifting it and like pulling things down and like adjusting stuff. Like that takes away from your just just experience of sport and being active, but like if you were actually competing, like it's distracting.
Yeah, and I think it's goes back to this, like, well, you should be grateful that
Yeah.
you got anything, and it's frustrating because I even feel frustrated that I wasn't aware of this because it became so normalized. And even today, I mean, there's obviously improvements, but there's been times in my athletic career where things are definitely, directly, they're made for males and then just assumed to be the same. But I didn't even notice because it's just so ingrained that we should just go with what we have and be grateful that we get to, play a sport, that we don't feel like we have the right to, question some of these things that don't fit us well and that are made for males predominantly, which is such a frustrating thing because we, obviously should be able to make those advances and stand up for adequate uh, gear. Like that's the very least we could do. Like that's such a
Yeah.
basic need for athletics beyond any other performance. Like you have to have gear that is comfortable and fits you well.
Yeah.
So that's just such a crazy concept.
Well, and it's a gatekeeper too, right? Not only in your ability to actually find something, like afford something, but also like to find something that fits your body. So a lot of this gear too is very much like they're straight sizes, right? Kind of like traditional sizes. But if you are someone who's in a larger body or wear extended sizes, your options are even fewer, right? Like there really isn't that much option. So that's almost kind of implicitly saying like this is the type of person or body who is allowed to be active, who's allowed to be outdoors, because that's what I'm. Those are the bodies I'm going to make gear and clothing and equipment available for.
Yeah, those limitations are just not okay and need to obviously be changed. I don't know how else to put it. It's just not something that we should settle for. So my last kind of question before we end the episode with the question that everyone gets to answer on this podcast is, with all of these things considered, where do we go from here? What needs to, I mean, I know there's a lot of things that need to be done, but just looking at it as a whole, what do you think is next for female athletics?
Yeah, like I said, I'm really excited about kind of where we are with women's sports right now and kind of the potential that we see. I think that it's maintaining this enthusiasm, maintaining this interest in these sports and these athletes and these stories, right? That it's not just every time the World Cup comes up, then we start to talk about it, or every time the Olympics come around, like we talk about it. Like it needs to be more than just these marquee events. It needs to be a consistent part of everyday conversation when we talk about sports, that we talk about women's sports in the same way that we talk about men. Um, and then I think in terms of, more of the like female athlete health and performance piece of it, it is having these conversations, right? Like continuing to talk about this stuff because like, I mean, like we've been talking about, there's a lot of stuff we didn't realize, right, until recently, or just never crossed your mind because you just always took it for granted or just, never thought to question it. And so I think it is having these conversations and kind of bringing these things to light, because that's the only way we're going to start to make some progress, right? Is if people gain more knowledge and understand what's happening, like understand what some of the blind spots are in the system and start to question, right? Like why this is and what can I do to make a difference? I think more on like an individual personal level for folks, it is, yeah, advocating for yourself. I mean, you had said at the beginning, feeling validated by some of the stories that you read in the book. And that was really my hope for the book in a lot of ways, so that girls and women could see themselves in these other stories and see their experiences expressed. Because oftentimes we feel like there's something wrong with us. There's something that I did wrong. There's something wrong with my body. When no, it's just the way it is. And the system wasn't designed to accommodate that or even to recognize what was going on. So I think it is that continuing to like, educate yourself, advocate for yourself, and maintain this like spotlight and attention on women's sports.
Yeah, well, thank you for doing this. Like just even speaking up about women's sports. Like I I was so intrigued by your book just because it's not a common topic, and so I appreciate that you are talking about it, and I appreciate that you're talking about it here too. Um, I think that's such an important first step, and I think all people can do a little bit more, especially like female athletes. Like your experiences are valid, and talking about them is just going to make it more acceptable, and that accommodation will come from hearing more stories. I think that's super important. um,
Yeah.
I have one last question. Everyone gets to answer this one. What does it look like for you to live authentically?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this question all afternoon. I'm like, how do I answer this? Um, and I think that it's really, at least for me, it living authentically really is kind of tapping into, or at least understanding, right? Like what brings you joy. And I don't know, at least at this point in my life, or this phase of my life or season of my life, I keep coming back to this idea of joy and what that means, and frankly wanting more of it in my life. And I feel like those opportunities and instances in which I have a joyful experience, or I'm able to kind of tap into that more, that's when I feel kind of most myself, and most authentic.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for being here and for sharing your wisdom. For everyone listening, definitely go buy Christine's book, Up to Speed. Highly recommend. But thank you just for sitting down and having this conversation. Like I said, I think this is such an important step for female athletics in general. So thank you for being here.
No, thank you so much for having me. This has been such a great conversation. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. We would love to hear what you found valuable in this episode. So please DM us on Instagram at Authentic Performance or leave a review. They're super, super helpful for us. We're so thankful that you're on this journey with us and want to invite you to be a part of the Authentic Performance fam. You can check out more of how we're supporting athletes at theauthenticperformance.com. Also, let us know what you want to hear on the podcast next, or who you want to hear. We appreciate your feedback and want to give you the best possible resources and support. In the meantime, think about how you can live authentically.